Welcome everybody. So I am back and bringing you guys a brand new movie review. I just got out of the theater for 1917. So if you see an image of 1917 in the background of my video, that is the movie that we're going to be discussing. This movie is directed by Sam Mendes and also stars Colin Firth and Benedict Cumberbatch, as well as a variety of different cast and characters. In this movie, we start off seeing a group of our main protagonists as well as another one of these soldiers kind of sleeping in the fields. Then it kind of leads us through the trenches of World War I. And then from there on, we go in through the no man's land and the trench warfare sequences, which if you've read any sort of history book in the past, if you've ever been taught about World War I, kind of like myself when I was a kid, this war pretty much fascinates me as well as a variety of other people, and I think this movie is going to do really well at the box office. Images of sort of the no man's land are as haunting as you've ever seen them before, especially even recently with Wonder Woman. I think that trench warfare sequence is really awesome, and this movie is as horrific as humanly possible. This isn't filmed in the same style as Saving Private Ryan, where you've pretty much got sort of a message that has to be delivered to a war general in order to stop sort of the Allies from advancing against German-occupied World War I in Europe. And it's really cool to kind of see sort of that stuff, just because I am a history buff myself. I really am interested in World War I and sort of the time period that's involved within the story. And it was kind of cool to see sort of a new take, especially the fact that this movie is supposed to be filmed sort of like a one-take shot, being that some movies that have sort of one-take scenes within their films, this was supposed to be cut and filmed similar to those films, but on a larger scale, where it's supposed to be the entire film was kind of shot like that. And actually, contrary to popular belief, this is definitely not sort of a one-shot take film. There's sequences where you see sort of arcs, where it kind of arc transitions, where it kind of arcs around in sort of a 360-degree sort of transition against some of the actors, and there's sort of whip pans and stuff and places where they go through buildings and stuff throughout this movie, and you can kind of tell where they've kind of transitioned and cut through some of the sequences. But while you're watching this movie, you're kind of thinking, holy shit, like this is pretty cool, because they have it pretty much cut once. And I was actually pretty surprised that even this early in the morning when I went to go see this movie, that there was a lot of people in the theater with me. So it was a really cool experience kind of watching this with a group of people. And I'd have to give hats off to sort of the production design team, as well as sort of the visual effects crew, as well as sound design and everybody that worked on this film, because while they could have done sort of a CGI fest film, while they could have done sort of a big budget sort of action adventure sort of war film, they really took this seriously. And some of these scenes that are in this film are really haunting, especially when they go to a French city that's pretty much being burned to the ground, and you kind of see sort of this haunting scene where it's pretty much lit with flares and stuff like that that are being shot off by the enemy soldiers, and there's a building that's being burnt to the ground. And while that's happening, one of our protagonists is being pretty much shot at and constantly by German soldiers. I think there's a lot of really cool sequences like that within this movie. The first being when you guys finally go over the first trench warfare scene, you're kind of constantly expecting them to get bombarded by enemy fire or even mortar shells going off and stuff like that, but it doesn't happen. And sort of you're kind of tense and on your seat throughout most of this movie. Even in sort of the giant craters of no man's land, there's mix between dead bodies and horses and stuff like that, and it really feels dark, gritty, and dirty within this film. And there's sequences where they actually do fall into some of these craters and stuff, which one of the main characters at the beginning of the film is like, if you fall into one of these craters, it will be difficult to kind of pull you out and probably won't happen, so you'll pretty much be stuck there. Then they go to sort of this underground bunker complex, and they're finding out that the German soldiers pretty much built these gigantic and pretty complex bunker systems where they've got crew quarters and stuff like that. And there's also trench foot that they have to worry about dealing with in some of these sequences, which you've heard about in sort of history classes. Not talked about as much as one would kind of hope that they would talk about some of the diseases that were kind of inside these trenches when they were bombarded by not only sort of the enemy fire and the blood and sort of all the gross, disgusting stuff that they had to deal with fighting these different battles. It's also sort of a testament to how these soldiers survived, because after they go through this whole sequence, there's a sequence where they're going through the tunnel systems and of this complex. A rat pretty much falls on top of one of the tripwires that the main character's like, oh, there's a tripwire here, you better be careful. And they're following this rat around as it's kind of crawling around looking for food, and it kind of drops on one of these tripwires and pretty much explodes, and the entire pretty much bunker complex starts like crumbling around them, and they have to kind of find their way out of it, and kind of on the edge of the seat, because you don't know if one of the main characters is going to die, and you actually get a fake out death sequence in this where you think the soldier has been killed, but then his friend pretty much uncovers him out of the rubble. He finally makes his way out, only to find out once he fired off the flares that they make their way to this village, sort of farmhouse situation, kind of like in Battlefield. This movie does feel a lot like a Battlefield or sort of a Call of Duty type of game, where the camera system is pretty much shot as if it's a one-take shot, where it kind of feels like you're following the soldiers like a video game character or someone going through a cutscene or something like that. And there's a scene where one of the main characters is drinking a thing of milk, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, one of these German planes comes crashing to the ground and slams into the hut, and then it pretty much sets it on fire. And you don't know that this German soldier is actually the bad guy until later on in the film, where he kind of pulls out a knife and stabs one of our hero protagonists and kills him. That's when you find out that he's trying to get this message not only to one of the ally generals, but he's also trying to get a message out to his brother. In a way, it's kind of like Saving Private Ryan, where you have to get not only this message to one of the battalions, but you're they're also trying to rescue this person's brother and trying to meet up with them. So it does feel like that. And if you do like that movie, which I definitely do, I think that's one of Steven Spielberg's best war films that he's ever done. I think that you're really going to enjoy this movie. And there's a lot of really cool moments within this movie. There's a lot of times where not only is it trying to sort of push you through this kind of gigantic war film, but it's taking its time to kind of do some slower moments where they're kind of talking back and forth. There's a sequence where they're talking about how this character hates rats and stuff, and that one of the soldiers had his ear bitten off by one of the rats, and he was making a big fuss about that throughout most of this film. That's when you kind of get to the farmhouse sequence and the whole German thing. And then after that, you kind of go to the French city where it's being pretty much bombarded by German occupied soldiers. They're burning the city to the ground, and it looks pretty much like a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and it's really intriguingly shot. When I was watching this in the movie theater, I was like, holy shit, this is kind of like a painting or like a really cool photo, because this is really artistic in the way that they shot it with the flares, with the lighting, and sort of the cinematography that they're doing with this scene. You really are pretty much put in sort of that situation. It's something that I haven't really seen before. And then that leads to them, one of the main protagonists, like strangling one of the German soldiers, trying to keep him quiet so that he doesn't alert one of the guards. And as he's doing this, as he's like going through this wreckage of the buildings and stuff like that, he's being shot at by enemy fire and stuff like that. He's trying to find a place to hide. He eventually meets this French girl, and she's pretty much hiding underneath one of these basements and trying to care for this child that she pretty much found. And she doesn't know who this child's parents are or where this child's from, but she's pretty much acting sort of like the surrogate mother to this child. And it's actually a girl, which they make a statement about in this movie. And previously, this main character got some expired milk because it was left in sort of a tin can, and I'm guessing probably doesn't smell that good, but because of the fact these people are malnourished and haven't had water and food and stuff for days, which they explain in this movie, he pretty much takes some of that and puts it in his cantina because he's pretty much emptied it. And due to the fact that during this whole trench warfare scene, there's a scene where he's kind of helping his friend kind of move it throughout the barbed wire and stuff, and he kind of grabbed one of the barbed wire, started bleeding and stuff. He kind of used the water in his cantina to kind of clean out the blood and stuff to kind of patch himself up, which there's a lot of consequences in this movie. This movie does deal with a lot of the horrors of war, a lot of the horrors of war that you've heard about in sort of your textbooks and the history books and stuff like that, especially when these two main characters fall into one of these craters and it's filled with water and dead bodies, and one of the main characters is trying to hunker down so he doesn't get spotted by the enemy soldiers, and he kind of presses his hand accidentally into one of the chests of the dead soldiers that's got a hole blown through his chest. Some of these scenes are pretty gruesome, some of these scenes are pretty gritty, and that's kind of the reason why I really like this movie. I think that this movie is really well shot. The story of this movie is really interesting. Cinematography, while they could have used a lot of visual effects and while they could have used a lot of CGI to kind of trick the audience, they definitely didn't. And as a filmmaker myself, I was watching this in the theater and I was trying to figure out how they filmed this. Some of these scenes kind of left me scratching my head, and even I was like, how did they film some of this shit? And this is just one of those movies that I think is going to be studied in film classes and stuff like that for a pretty good time to come. I think this is one of those movies that audiences are going to come back to because this movie definitely does have a rewatchability factor to it, and that's always something that I'm looking forward to with a movie that just come out, especially one that's winning Golden Globes and is up for the Oscars and stuff like that. It has rewatchability factor and something that I myself am going to like, and this is definitely something I think that once it comes out on Blu-ray, I'm definitely going to probably buy it. Maybe I'll do a more extensive review on this, but this movie has you on the edge of your seat throughout most of the film. You find interesting things about the war that you never really would have if you hadn't went and watched this movie. So this is definitely one of those movies that, unlike a lot of movies that I saw last year, I think this is one of those films that you can definitely go out, have a good time with, you know, eat some popcorn and stuff, and kind of get engrossed in this war. There's a scene where they go to this convoy and they're trying to take him to this other city so that way he can kind of deliver the message, and it's pretty much on the last leg of the trip before he goes to the French city. The convoy is pretty much stuck by a tree, and you kind of see all the soldiers trying to move the tree trunk and everything, and one of the army commanders is kind of yelling at them. He's like, it's a bloody freaking tree, just move it already and stuff, which I thought was kind of funny. There are a lot of trees and stuff like that in this movie, and there's even sort of a slow sequence where after one of the protagonists kind of falls in sort of a ravine after the whole French sequence where you kind of see that whole city just kind of being destroyed and burned to the ground, kind of falls into the river, which kind of leads to the last city where you need to deliver sort of the message to the general. You see him going through the ravine and stuff, and he's trying to dodge rocks and sort of trees and stuff that has like dead bodies of dead German soldiers to it, and it's pretty horrific. There's some moments of beauty in that sequence, even with sort of the terror and sort of the stuff that's going on, but I really do like this movie. I really did like the part with Colin Firth and Benedict Cumberbatch. I think that even with as little of time that we get to spend with them in this movie, we kind of see sort of what they're kind of dealing with and how they're trying to manage this sort of wartime situation that everything seems lost and hopeless, and they think that they're going to be able to win this war pretty much by the next day, but they're kind of being led into sort of this ambush that would completely decimate the troop battalion that they're about to send in. They're pretty much sending them in waves, so they're sending them in the first wave, and then the second wave is the one that they're trying to warn off the attack. And by the end of the film, it's so exhausting. You've kind of lived through this experience that you're like, holy shit, I just hope that this guy kind of makes it through it. And eventually he does. Eventually he saves the day, and one of the commanders actually kind of congratulates him on helping save the entire battalion and stuff, and you're actually rewarded with seeing sort of the other sort of protagonist's brother that was actually killed. You kind of see that sequence, and he's kind of like, you know, where's my brother? story, like what happened to him and everything. That's when you see him kind of tell him that your brother was killed. He was pretty much stabbed by one of the German pilots that kind of crash landed when he's kind of taking a sip of milk and stuff like that. And this heart-wrenching scene where it's like, if you've ever lost somebody, you kind of get that feeling. And this movie definitely delves into sort of the hero's journey with several elements where after the ravine, you kind of see him kind of crawling out of the river and stuff, and he's kind of questioning whether or not he's able to kind of finish off this journey. And even some of the soldiers are like, you're kind of crazy, like why would you want to do this, and like why would you try and get this message out there when all is pretty much lost. And eventually kind of understand why he's doing this and why he's trying to save a whole bunch of people that are about to be pretty much shot up and killed behind enemy lines and stuff like that. But I really do think that with the story, with the cinematography, with the visual effects, that this movie definitely deserves an A+ rating. I think that Sam Mendes definitely did a good job, especially with the whole one take sort of feel to it. Now it's not, like I said before, a one take film, but I think that if you're a war film buff, if you like sort of these war movies like Black Hawk Down, Saving Private Ryan, and some of the other movies that have come before, and you're definitely going to enjoy your time in this film. So I would highly recommend that you guys go see this movie in theaters. Hopefully you guys learn a thing or two about the movie industry. And as always guys, rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.